Immediately after war was declared in 1939, it was a stark necessity for Britain, which imported the vast majority of its food from abroad. Every British citizen was issued with a coloured coded ration book. Green books for the children under the age of 5, blue books for 5 to 15-year-olds, and buff coloured books for adults. These were then stamped in shops to indicate that you had received your weekly ration. Virtually every food was rationed, with the exception of fish, offal, fruit and vegetables, eggs, milk and orange juice. They were not rationed, but everyone received specific allocation depending on the quantities available. Similar, tinned meat, such as spam, and tinned or dried fruit and vegetables were not normally rationed, but had to be purchased using the points issued with your ration book. Each person was usually given an allocation of 24 points to spend as they liked. Yet even though an item might not have been on the official ration list, that wasn't to suggest it was plentiful. With supply links often affected by the conflict, many perishables simply couldn't reach the market, and imported goods dwindled inversely to nothing. Even the supply of foods such as chocolate, which had a long shelf life, was restricted by transport limitations. Children who lived near to Mars or Cadbury's. The factories were never short of sweets, while youngsters elsewhere in the country might not see them for years. On the whole, rural communities tended to eat more hearty meals thanks to local farms. It wasn't just food that was rationed. Petrol and other fuels were all strictly allocated to the public to maximise supplies to the military. Shoes and clothes had to be brought using your ration coupons. A real problem for parents whose children could outgrow their shoes in a matter of weeks. Even furniture was rationed, although newlyweds and anyone whose home had been bombed out were given a special exemption. While rationing was in effect, many families relied on their local shopkeepers to tip them off when particular items were going to be in stock, or to reserve the items for them. Otherwise, it was a matter of queuing and hoping you reached the head of the queue before products ran out. If they saw a queue, and most people were conditioned to instantly join it, the Dig for Victory campaign was launched to encourage people to raise their own product in the garden or a nearby allotment. Some families also kept chickens or rabbits in their yards to supply eggs and meat when times were hard. Careful explanations had to be prepared for the day when a beloved pet rabbit ended up in the stew pot for dinner. The government also promoted the importance of making sure that children had an adequate supply of vitamin C. In the early stages of the war, they imported blackcurrant syrup from the US to bolster the country's vitamin C intake after 1942. They instead offered subsidised orange juice, rosehip syrup and cod liver oil, both to children and expectant mothers. Advertising campaigners were launched to promote the eating of carrots. Never a child's favourite meal, as they were easy to grow for even the most basic garden. Shopkeepers were under strict instructions to allocate scarce items such as fruit, and particularly fruit that was not grown in the UK, such as oranges, lemons, grapes and bananas, and to make sure that children and young mothers were first in line to receive them. But as the war progressed and supply lines crumbled, such fruit became a distant memory. Unsurprisingly, a healthy black market sprang up to provide any items that were in demand, and certain unscrupulous shopkeepers were known to set aside part of their official allocation of food to sell privately at a tidy profit. Anyone who had friends or relatives abroad in countries such as Canada or the US could appeal to them to send a private food parcels. Rationing also led to some old culinary preference, with fresh eggs in such short supply, and most people were forced to turn to dried eggs from the USA. As an alternative, initially treating powdered eggs with disgust, many children eventually grew fond of the taste and admit to having nostalgic cravings for them to this day. And when the Soviet Union joined the Allied side during the war, it helped introduce a fad for traditional Russian recipes such as borscht, which could be easily made from your homegrown beetroots. While children around the country might have complained bitterly about the sameness of every meal or the smallness of the portions, many also had admiration for their parents, who were seemingly able to conjure up a meal out of nothing, day in and day out. It might not have been a feast fit for a king, but the very fact that it filled your tummy was a miracle indeed. Food rationing came into effect almost the moment war was declared, but it was to be another 2 years before the government imposed close rationing. The Board of Trade introduced a coupon scheme similar to that used for certain food items, with everyone initially receiving a boot that gave them 66 coupons per year to spend on everything from underwear to overcoats. This, of course, presupposed that there were garments in shops on which to spend the coupons. As the war progressed, it became harder and harder to find new clothes as certain fabrics went out of production and more factories transferred their attention to servicing the war effort. At the same time as the clothes coupons began circulating, the government also encouraged Britons to make a do amend with a series of advertisements featuring the character Mrs. So-and-so. Circulars were also issued which suggested how to stitch and repair threadbare garments, or how to transform different textiles, such as old curtains, into new guises. Mothers were encouraged to unstitch woolen jumpers that children had outgrown and reknit them a size larger with a bit of extra scrap wool. Fathers came up with a number of fanciful ways to dismantle and reassemble shoes to fit growing feet. The campaign was certainly successful. There are countless stories of how people kept abreast of fashion, the clever and resourceful ways. With the war came the blackout. That meant that no lights could be shown after dark, and we had a air raid warden to enforce this. Many men and women who were in reserved occupations vital to the war effort, or who were too old to be called up or were unfit for service, were air raid wardens. Patrolling the streets during raids. All our windows had shutters or very thick curtains, or shut out the light, and the windows were taped to stop flying glass. If they were shattered by a bomb blast, all vehicles, including bikes, and their lights shaded by a hood, if you showed a light from your windows, or car, a bike, or even a torch, you would first begin to be given a warning. Then the second, assuming a bomb didn't hit you, of course, you would be fined. There were no street lights, so everyone carried a torch, along with their gas mask. We were taught to use our gas properly at school, as we were told our lives might depend on it. We were taught some of our lessons, at least once a week, wearing our gas mask, which was most uncomfortable and sweaty. It made some children sick and claustrophobic, and we were always glad to get them off again. Throughout the war we were given time off school at regular intervals to research for supposed escaped prisoners of war or spies. This was very exciting. We would take our gas masks, notebooks and pencil to make notes of what we saw. It was designed to make us vigilant and aware of strangers. Travelling was made difficult because road signs were removed and street names obliterated. Maps were withdrawn from sale, newspapers and radio were censored, and even the weather forecast was suspended. Everyone had identity cards or had to carry some other means of identification. Even we children were told not to give directions to strangers. On the other side of the country, one strange sight I remember was a field full of signposts pointing in all directions. They'd been taken away from crossroads and junctions to confuse invaders. We had a strict blackout, although heavy black material was in short supply. Families helped each other to make wooden frames to fit inside the windows that had heavy black felt or layers of thick paper or cardboard nailed onto them. I had an aunt, uncle and cousin living just outside Cambridge, and they got to know many of the young flyers at the RAF bomber station nearby. One night the squadron returned from operations over Europe. There were enemy bombers above the area waiting for the airfield landing lights to be switched on, so they could locate the airfield and put it out of commission. So the control tower dared not switch on the lights. The bomber pilots pleaded over their radios for the lights to enable them to land, as they were very low on fuel. Their pleas were in vain, so they had to keep circling over a wide area until one by one they crash-landed. All those young lives. The fear of invasion was never far from anyone's thoughts, particularly in the early years of the war. Parents warned their children about the dangers of German parachutists and give them instructions on what to do if they ever came across one. The thought that German spies could be of the only people led to all sorts of counter-espionage, games in the playground, slogans like "Walls have ears" and "Careless talk costs lives" reinforced this. Then, as prisoners began to be taken and brought to camps around the country, a sight that became commonplace to children in some rural areas was of enemy servicemen working on farms and in the community. Until 1943, most of the German prisoners of war were sent to Canada, because until then the threat of an invasion was still present. After that threat receded, more camps were created in Britain. So the enemy was not so far away. The Italians, who were also held at a prisoner of war camp, lived under slightly different circumstances. However, he recalls going to visit relatives and seeing Italian prisoners of war wandering around the countryside. Wore battle dress, uniform with a diamond on the back to show they were prisoners of war. By the end of the war, Italy was supposed to be neutral, so they were very loosely supervised. You would just see them walking down country lanes, herding cattle. The British film industry continued to work throughout the war, and theatres doggedly kept up morale, even as the bombs were falling. The cinema offered an inspiration and a refuge from the worst of the wartime life. as with the famous slogan of the Windmill Theatre in London, "We never closed." Many cinema managers and projectionists defied the air raid sirens to allow films to unspool. Many cinema goers remember remaining in their cinema seats throughout the bombing raids, too enthralled or maybe just too scared to move. The wireless was one of the government's primary means of news and propaganda. Many young boys and girls will follow the progress of the war, listening to the daily bulletins and chart the movements of the Allies and the enemy on maps in their bedrooms. But there was room for entertainment on the wireless too, and many a family would sit close to the big box in the corner of the living room to listen to the long-running shows like Sunday Half Hour, Saturday Night Theatre, which began broadcasting in 1940 and 1943 respectively. In 1942 there was the inauguration of what has become a radio institution like Desert Island Disc. The first ever guest introduced by the present presenter Roy Plumley was the comedian Vic Oliver. Every Thursday night during the war, life in British households came to a stop as the family gathered around the wireless for its That Man Again, or as it became popular known as ITMA. No other radio show captured the spirit of the times with such accuracy, nor was popular with the British public. More than 40% of the population listened to the show each week and without fail. With newspapers struggling to cope with paper shortages and ink rationing, it was inevitable that popular pre-war comics would also suffer a similar fate. There was even a ban that would last the duration of the war imposed on the launch of any new comics. Operation Pied Piper was the government's code name for the scheme to evacuate more than 3 million children from towns where they would be in danger from bombing to areas where they would be relatively safe from attack. Children from well-off homes, as well as those from slum areas, were separated from their parents, brothers and sisters in a huge social upheaval that tore families apart and virtually emptied towns and cities of a whole generation. Some evacuees were away from home for many years. In November 1939, the magazine Illustrated sent a reporter to the Essex village of Lickle Adam to find out how the evacuees there were faring. One little girl told them, "I play games in the fields with my friends and we're going to stay here till the war's over." Evacuees have mixed memories. Some settled in and were happy, but some were billeted with people who had no understanding or affection for children. A few were treated as unpaid servants, but the resilience of children was evident. Once they were over their homesickness and the shock of strange environment, most of them enjoyed the novelty of country life. In November 1938, Neville Chamberlain's government agreed to relax the normal entry requirements so children who were fleeing the Nazi regime in Europe could come to Britain. Immediately after Britain admitted children from Europe, many of them Jewish, a number of organisations, later known as the Refugee Children's Movement, began to work together to organise the removal of as many children as possible from Austria, Germany, Poland and Czechoslovakia. The process became known as the Kindertransport. To be eligible, each child had to be aged 17 or under and able to pay £50 to cover the cost of their repatriation. When the war was over, they were then issued with a numbered identity card and photo. All they were allowed to take with them on their long journey was a small sealed suitcase and a maximum of 10 marks in cash. The first wave of the Kindertransport arrived in the port of Harwich on December the 2nd, 1938, and the last known transport left Holland on May 14, 1940. In that brief window of time, around 10,000 children were brought to England. Before war had ended, before war had even begun, people with back gardens were encouraged to have Anderson shelters built, named after John Anderson, who was in charge of air raid precautions. These came in a kit. To the war, different brands of pop also started to reappear, much to children's delight. And one of the highlights was to be found in the picture houses. The ice cream girl, with the spotlight on her, started to come back to the cinemas. A sign indeed that things were looking up. And as Mr. Churchill would say, let us go forward together. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth lasts for 1,000 years, men will still say this was their finest hour.